There's this fascinating question about the role of art and technology in civic engagement today. We all kind of grew up thinking we knew the role of art. It was important, but it wasn't at the main table. What I want to talk about today is how that role is changing, almost mischievously so, and art has an enormous role in innovation, in urban design, clearly in industry and in technology development, and ultimately in economic development. Now, this comes from my own experience being a tech entrepreneur in the Bay Area, having launched a few internet companies, and then up in San Francisco realizing about 8 years ago that we had all of this amazing culture around software, emerging data visualization and software art, and we weren't really telling that story as ourselves as a city. So I co-founded something called Gray Area Foundation for the Art to try to bring all of that together. Right around the time that we started this, San Francisco opened up its data. We opened up the crime data, the transportation data. For example, here, Oakland, California opened its data, and citizens noticed that the crime of prostitution was being committed once a month from north to south on San Pablo Avenue. And looking at the data, they realized that wasn't how a crime was committed, that was lazy policing. And the act of opening that up, suddenly people were drawn into the environment, and a thing we found was when cities opened data, developers came in, software developers, artists, storytellers, and suddenly it was an attach point, an engagement point with the city. Technically, it's called an API, an application program interface. The data was opened up, and all these people that were busy doing something else realized the city was a platform that they could play with. That was a remarkable change. This is from an exhibit that we did a few years ago, and this shows crime in the part of town that we were in. Now, unfortunately, we were in the Tenderloin, and it had the most crime, and I'm worried if we're showing an art exhibit that's based on city data and people come here and see crime, they're going to yell at me. They're like, don't bring this up, it's a bad idea. I was thinking open wasn't such a good idea. Boy, was I wrong. We put something like that up, and the police came in and said, people are paying attention. I made that arrest. This was a part of town with the most single parents, and the moms were coming in and saying, people were paying attention here. So by opening up data, San Francisco created this invitation. For example, we had a very noisy part of town. What do you do about that? Artists went out and deployed sensors on their own volition on the walls and started gathering the data of where the noise was. And now suddenly we had something we could go talk to the city about, and we were collecting all of this. I got so excited about all of this app data artist thing. I went to City Hall one day, I was talking to one of our supervisors, and I was just going on about how all great this was, and he looked at me and go, what are you talking about? Will all of this art data app stuff get us elected? Will it help the city? And I realized I had enthusiastic data syndrome. That as much as we in the tech or art kind of cloistered world like this, we had to open this up. This had to be a conversation with everybody in the city, inclusively, to put new ideas on the table. Fortunately, we had an election coming up, and we decided to brand a series of innovation activities of hackathons and open government conversations, debates, all summer long as the Summer of Smart, reminiscent of another Summer of that San Francisco had. We had 16 candidates. All of them got involved in hackathons around food, around nutrition, urban development, transportation. Bureaucrats got involved. It's a thing of beauty to see a bureaucrat and a software developer, because a bureaucrat thinks, I'll have an idea, and they won't do it for 5 years if that. And a software developer says, I'll have it on Monday morning. This sped things up. Suddenly, the candidates had to take all these great ideas. We called it ideas worth stealing. And this created this generative system where ideas that were coming from the art and technology community were flowing into the city. Here's one of them. Our head of public works says, wherever I see public art, or in this case, like street art, I don't see graffiti. And wherever I see graffiti, I don't see public art. Can we do something about this? If you're a software developer, you know this is a dating app. You're trying to build a date between artists and building owners. That's one of the things that came out of it. Here's a more recent example. This is a project, and that's that art example. This is a device that was built, kind of created as an art project. It has sensors of air pollution, humidity, temperature, light. It was created as a project that we were doing with the National Endowment for the Arts, but it picked up steam. This project, in an open source manner, is now part of a global data canvas network where artists and citizens working with cities deploy sensors, can share data, and understand the air quality in all of their cities. And most interestingly, a Chinese manufacturer found this and said, we'd love to get involved. So we now have a Chinese manufacturer setting up shop in an industrial part of town and an art project becoming kind of a global conversation here. And this is kind of an example of what happens when you start deploying sensors in a city and people can share and work on all of that. This kind of effort has grown, and the most recent manifestation of it in San Francisco, oh, I should mention this. You know, we have this activist tradition in San Francisco. This is kind of from the Summer of Love. But there's a difference between the 1960s attitude towards dealing with the city and today. In the 1960s, if there was a problem, we protested the establishment. Today, we write to its API. This is what happens when the city's a platform and you feel like it's something you can get a hold of. Here's the most recent project. Market Street, which is our kind of main drag, is not that walking friendly, not that pedestrian friendly. It's slated to be torn up and redone in a couple of years, and there's a plan to make that better. But how would you activate it? How would you make it just completely delightful to be on the street? Well, based on the work we've done, the City Planning Department, funded by the Knight Foundation and working with an arts organization, realized we ought to open this up to the people. And so we had 50 projects come up from architects, designers, urbanists, spread out all over Market Street in the last week as a prototype for what the future might look like. Let me share that with you now.
Looking for a way, a process to actually bring that out into our public realm, and we thought our most important civic space, Market Street, would be a great place to start. How do you actually give that sense of individual agency to the community and to the residents of San Francisco?
It's not traditional public art. It's not commissioned, juried, incubated deeply. It's not thought of in a permanent or even semi-permanent way. Prototyping is something different. It's process in public space, it's experimentation. And the prototypes that we've selected, I consider all of them to be artistic. You know, and what I'm after there is an expanded definition of what art is. A world where more people think of themselves as artists and where artists are less marginalized and much more a part of the ongoing conversation and the ongoing fabric of their city.
So these projects went up for 4 days. They're being evaluated. Next summer, they'll come back having been studied. And the idea is to make things like this a permanent part of the city. And we're now looking at Market Street more like a Lego. The stuff won't be permanent. We'll always be updating it, always putting it in dialogue with people. And there's a number of things that we've learned from this. Probably one of the principal things that we learned is that, you know, prototypes are about failing and learning and seeing what works. And if you say failing and learning to an architect or someone who works in city government, it's terrifying. So this reduces the bar and opens that possibility up. We're kind of marrying up the sensibilities of web or technology development with cities and kind of reconciling them. It's less to-dos and more do-dos. It's a chance to kind of prototype and try things more. And importantly, it brings art out into new spaces. And we had 11 other Knight Foundation cities as part of us. This brings up the interesting role of the artist. You know, the artist has this interesting role of going across categories and discovering new things. And especially at a moment when we have so many new materials, code and things to discover, you find that this has a huge role in economic development. I was over at Autodesk recently talking with Mickey McManus, founder of Maya Design and now an Autodesk fellow.
Part of the idea here was, what if we engage with the extreme users and we just sort of wander, and we wander with them. We don't have a path. We just say the extreme users are probably doing things with our tools that we don't know about.
Not knowing anything about these technologies and then coming in and looking at what other people are doing and then saying, oh, I could use that, even though it's being used in architecture or in sculpture or to see all the different details that could actually be used in fashion that are not being used today. This is like kombucha culture. It can be cut and sewn exactly like leather is, but it's grown just from tea and sugar.
She's a fashion designer coming to use all these new industrial techniques. Autodesk is learning from her. She's learning from them. Autodesk was one of the people working on that Market Street prototyping project. John Seeley Brown, my friend who used to run Xerox PARC, pointed out that it's the artist who can see across disciplines and help push things and find new things. And we're seeing it works in the city, it works in industry. It's a phenomenal role, and artists have always had this notion of pointing out what's new. Perspective kind of helped drive the Renaissance. When Impressionism was created, it's because oil paints moved outdoors. And interestingly, whenever this happens, artists do these things, but often they get in trouble for it. For example, Impressionism was released, but whenever a new movement of art comes out, frequently people ask questions like, what is it? If you've seen the reviews of Impressionism lately, smear a panel with gray, plunk some black and yellow lines across it, and the enlightened few, the visionaries, explain, isn't that a perfect impression of the Bois de Meudon? And we see the same thing today when people talk about new technology-based art. This is from the first technology art show in 1968. And yet, technology artists can do amazing things for our cities.
This kind of gesture of climbing body, trying to, in a sense, climb up a surface. I was inspired by some footage of Africans trying to jump a fence to get into Europe. So there was like these tremendous climbing actions of really of a collective that's trying to, well, I guess, improve their life somehow.
So that's a project in Times Square that Daniel did. It's interesting to ask, what happens when you take this great energy to experiment on a city and these tools and techniques that are possible today, and what if you were to create a city just around that? A city that might be just a quarter of the size of Pittsburgh with the least government and the most freedom that you know, where you could make up your own rules and study that. Well, that actually exists. It's called Burning Man, the festival in California. 70,000 people build a temporary city every year, and it just has such a sense of agency. It doesn't exist unless you create it, and that form of art comes back to San Francisco and I think makes us a much more interesting and creative place. And so much of the innovation that's going on in the city right now is influenced by this. I'll give you one example. Oakland, California, like Pittsburgh, used to be largely industrial. It was 40% industrial. It's now down to just 4% industrial. Steel is 2% carbon. It's not a lot, but that makes all the difference in the world. Here's a space in Oakland that understands it needs to preserve some of that and create an economy around this.
This is Jingletown, Oakland. 6 months ago, this was not much more than a pigeon hotel and an abandoned storage facility. Today, it's become Moxie. It's an artist collective that is creating giant industrial sculpture. And not just that, it's an incubator for artists to think through, what's the business model for all of this? How do they work together? How do you get distribution for things like this and share this kind of art with the world?
I live in California, but I'm a Pittsburgher. I mean, I've repped that everywhere I've lived, all over this continent, especially with like kind of computer technology and as it interfaces existing industrial technology. We have capacities as single people and small groups to do things that were unimaginable and only at an industrial scale before. I think that changes the whole notion of what a maker, an artist, a sculptor, or even someone who's just a dabbler can actually do. I think that Buffalo, New York, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and Detroit come to mind as the three cities where makers, doers, and people who are interested in industry and or product development need to focus on. I mean, these are places where it's affordable, people want to work, they want to be engaged, and they could take some of the initiative that, you know, I've found out here in California and really catalyze some amazing stuff.
A lovely use of industrial space, and this kind of thinking has fed back amazingly in our city. I'll leave you with one more project created by two people from Burning Man using our city as the greatest canvas of all.
We're all moths, you know, we all get this attraction to light. We move into this space of reflectiveness.
What could turn out to be one of the most flamboyant and expensive works of public art in Bay Area history appears to be close to reality.
When you stand next to the bridge, it's like being next to the Grand Canyon.
If the Bay Bridge was your canvas, what would you do on it?
You just move into a space of awe and terror, and we all suddenly sit there transfixed just by the magnitude of this piece.
Villarreal is the light sculpture artist with the grand idea.
No one's ever done this before. This is something very unique. You know, you look down one side and it's 525 feet to the water. The other side is 250 feet to traffic.
Leo's interpretation of our discussions vastly exceeded anything I could have dreamed of. The impossibility is the thing that makes it possible. The impossibility is what inspires people to act around it.
With this entire project, there's certainly no guarantees. It's very complicated, it's very large scale.
People want to see it happen, and it shouldn't happen. These things just, they're not supposed to happen. The system is designed to say no.
You have to try. That's what I've learned, is that you just have to go for it.
So all of this is coming together now. The maker movement, the power of tools like this, the will to redo cities, this kind of new urbanism. The term that we're using to describe it is the maker city. It came up at the White House Makers Fair last year. We had 100 cities kind of sign on. I'm working on a book on this right now with Dale Doherty, who created the Maker Fair. And this seems to be one of the most exciting moments. And Pittsburgh, what better place? Here is a town that is got an enormous will to redevelop. It's steeped in all these manufacturing capabilities, has this wonderful art tradition, and as much of a software tradition as any place in the nation. If there's one place that can get it right, it's here. And it was such an honor to come and share this stuff with you, because all these ingredients are here, and this spark, this alloy of creativity, together with everything else, it will just be astounding. Thanks very much. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. Great. No, Peter, I'd ask you a question because I was going to ask you what's next, but I think you've already told us. There's so many nexts in what you've shown us, so much stuff that's looking ahead to what's coming for Pittsburgh or other places. It's really exciting. So there one other next, what's the other next thing? Since you covered about 3 of them. So is there a 4th one that we're going to learn about soon?
I think the big thing is that this tactical urbanism is now becoming strategic urbanism. City planners and architects are now realizing you can really use the crowd. The way that in social media, editors and brand managers had to learn this, architects used to think, please, not the crowd, but look at what this can do. I think that's what we should keep our eye on.
That's great. I appreciate
Thanks.
that. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.